Hello and welcome to Canvas+Paint. My name is Katie Guthrie and I am back with Garden City Arts to offer another fun painting tutorial video. Now I'm going to lead you through this painting step by step. Make sure before you get started you have all the supplies you need, including your paint kit if you purchase one from Garden City Arts, labeled with colors 1 through 8 on your palette. And of course, your canvas. Make sure you have it painted blue if you did not purchase the kit. That will come into play later in the painting. And of course, some brushes. I would highly recommend a large wash brush, a medium wash brush, and a round brush for details. You also need a piece of chalk, a cup of water, and a paper towel. If you have all of these things, you are ready to get started. All right, we're gonna jump right in with step number 1. First, you'll need 2 different colors for this step. Color number 1 and color number 2. Both of these colors have, cadmium red in it and slight amounts of cerulean blue for this guy, a whole bunch for that guy, and titanium white. So we're gonna be using these 2 colors to create the very soft, misty background of our painting. This first step, let's go fast. We want to blend. We also want to allow some of our underpainting, which is our blue canvas, to show through. And we're going to be doing a whole bunch of this, okay? A whole bunch of Karate Kid. And make sure you grab your biggest brush. I always dip my brush in paint water to get started with. And because we want really transparent light layers, we are going to need to mix water into our paint. Otherwise, it will be more opaque rather than transparent. When you add water to paint, it makes it transparent, lighter, and easier to work with. So I'm going to start with color number 1, and I'm mixing a whole bunch of water and paint together. Now, we don't want it so runny that it will pool on your canvas, but you do want enough water that it's going to glide effortlessly and show some of this blue through. I'm going to use the broad side of my brush to start off with to fill in a whole bunch of space. And you can see my layers are very nice and transparent, and I'm starting in the middle. I want a lot of blue showing through in the middle. So up and down, big brush strokes. Don't worry about the very end of the canvas or the very bottom of the canvas. We'll put a bridge there. And now that I have my kind of very light, transparent middle, I'm gonna take my brush with more paint. I'm gonna use the top edge of my brush at its thinnest point. And I'm going to start right in on the side. And the goal is to have a transition or a gradient from that really thin transparent paint to thicker paint on the edge. So I'm going to do that to both sides. This side is done. Now I'm going to come over and do this side. And then I will transition into color number 2. And color number 2 can be nice and thick, just like I'm using color number 1 right now. Okay, still letting some of the blue show through, but not as much as we did in the middle. And keep in mind, if your transition is not perfect, don't worry about it. We'll put a tree on it. It's gonna be fine, okay? So no worries. We can hide things in paintings quite easily. Now, I don't have any water mixed into this red paint, and do you see how thick it was? I don't really like that. I want it to be a little bit softer. So I'm gonna swirl, tap, and dry my brush. Whenever you have a paint problem, clean out your brush. This is the number 1 thing that is the best thing you can do. And a lot of times you want to start with a clean damp brush on that area that you've just left if you're trying to get a blend like this, and you'll move a lot of paint and it'll look much better. Okay. So now I have a little bit of color number 2 on there. I want to put a little color number 1 on top, just to transition a little bit better. So remember, you can jump back and forth between these colors. That's absolutely fine. So I'm gonna do the same thing over here. Get it a little bit lighter, and then we'll be done. So get your backgrounds how you want them, and then we will move on to our next step. Okay, we're back with step number 2. Now, You do not have to let your canvas dry completely for this next step. It may be easier if you make a mistake to let this dry, because we're gonna move on to trees. And trees oftentimes can be tricky for people. So if you are worried about making mistakes, I would let your canvas dry before you move on to step number 2, or move on with this step. So I'm gonna grab my brush, I'm gonna show you how to do trees really quickly, and then we'll move on to our bridge. I'm using color number 3, which is basically all of the colors in this are the same until we get to the leaves. It is cerulean blue and actually quinacridone and white. So I'm going to grab a little bit of paint on the top edge of my brush. I'm turning it to my thinnest point to make trees. I like to use a big brush when I do this. Other people like to use smaller brushes. You do you. I am going to start with smaller trees in the background, and then I'm going to make bigger trees in the foreground. Background is farther back and up higher on the canvas. Foreground is closer and lower on the canvas. If I'm creating background trees, I'm gonna mix a little bit of water into my paint so it's just a little bit more transparent, so it has the illusion of being back in that misty, beautiful background that we've just created. So I'm going to start with a very thin, small tree, and it looks like I'm gonna have to use a little bit more paint, otherwise it's gonna blend into the background, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And then after I have my trunk, I just come off and branch a few branches off to the sides. Now, once you have that done, make sure it comes up off the top and comes down low and past where you stopped your misty background. Once you have that done, check it out. What do you think? Okay, look at what you've done. I have one trunk and I have 2 branches going off. They are not all attached to the tree at the same point, and they are not 90-degree angles. They are acute angles, smaller than 45 degrees. That is a good way to go when you don't know how to do trees, or if you have trouble doing trees, okay? Keep it simple. Don't add too many more. Okay, I'm gonna continue going. I'm gonna add more paint and less water to get some big ones in the foreground. So now that I have a small one, I'm gonna do a big one right here, and it's gonna go all the way up to the top of my canvas, and then I can add in some smaller branches, sorry. How hard you press on your brush matters. So if I press really hard, I get a thick line. If I press lighter for these little branches, I get a thin line, okay? Very important to control how your brush works. Now, if you want, you can add some more branches off of your main branches to make it look just a little bit more full. Be careful, don't go too crazy. I'm on the verge of going too crazy. Okay, I'm gonna speed up the video and continue doing this, and then we'll move forward in just a moment. All right, we have our trees finished. Now I have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 trees. I would keep it to under 10 trees for sure. 7 is even kind of a crowded forest. If you want to put some other trees in the background, you can use color number 1 and color number 3 and mix them together to make really light colors that are like shorter trees that are in the background. I don't think you necessarily need it, but if you'd like that, go for it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and start with my bridge. I need color number 4, which is just basically a darker version of this. And I'm going to break out my chalk and draw in my bridge. Now, if you have trees that are not dry, this is going to be a difficult step for you. I would let it dry maybe a little bit before starting. I'm gonna see if I can make it work. So I'm gonna start by deciding where to put the end of my bridge. And this really just depends on you and your design aesthetic. I would definitely keep it under the halfway point. Any higher up your canvas, it's gonna look weird. I'm gonna bring it to right about there and put in the beginning line for my bridge. Then I'm going to have diagonal lines coming back and ending off the bottom of my canvas, not the sides, the bottom. So I'm going to, cause a mess with my paint and try to get my angles to be very similar so that they kind of line up. Okay, my angles for my bridge. After I have what I'm happy with, looks like a bridge, I'm going to just fill it in. And this step is super easy. I'm going to speed up the video and you can go at your own pace. I'm going to use paint on the top edge of my brush on my thinnest point, and I'm going to outline first. I'm going to have to do probably 2 layers of paint on this just to make it thick enough to stand out and cover everything. And then once I've outlined, I just fill it in. Stay inside your lines, don't be like your teacher. Oops. And fill it in. And again, you're going to have to do at least 2 layers because this paint is going to appear very thin. It's actually ultramarine blue and quinacridone, and so ultramarine blue tends to be kind of transparent depending on the brand of paint you use. I'm going to speed up the video and we'll move on in a second. Okay, we have a bridge. Now we're going to backtrack a little bit here and go back to color number 3. And we are going to put in some details on our bridge to make it look more like a wooden bridge rather than a big fat trapezoid. Or is that a rhombus? I can't remember. Anyways, so we're going to use the top edge of our brush and we're going to just put in these little lines from side to side. I'm using the top edge of my brush, a whole bunch of paint, and I'm working while my painting is still wet. The reason you want to do this is because you can get wet on wet blending that is very effective and easier to manipulate than if you do wet on dry. Okay. And wet on dry is basically when your canvas is dry and your paint is wet. I'm working where my canvas is wet and my paint is wet. Now, I have a whole bunch of paint on there. I can come back in with my color number 4 and be a little bit more delicate and blend in some of this. If you go outside your bridge, no worries, you can erase that. You'll want to do that as quick as possible. You take a clean, damp brush, start on the outside, and do this little back and forth motion and push that paint back in. Okay, so I just need to clean up my edges and then I will be ready to move on. And that's it for this step. So make your bridge look as old and wooden as possible, and then we will move on. Okay, now here is the first challenge of the painting. We need to draw in our rails for our bridge. It can be tricky, but if you spend a little bit of time drawing it out and are happy with it before you start painting, it will be just fine, and I think you'll be quite pleased with it. So first off, I'm going to make sure that my railings are about the same height. So what I do is I put a little dot on either side that is about the same height. If you want to get really technical, use the end of your brush and make sure you measure, and oh, it's close enough. Next, I want to decide where my bridge is going to end. Our rails are going to go back and they're going to disappear on top of the bridge. So I'm going to bring my line here, and I need to get my angle right. This is where it gets tricky. I'm going to curve up and then come down to the edge of the bridge. So curve up, try to get that curve about the same, curve up and then come down. Not in the center of the bridge, but on the sides, just like that. Now, if you need to erase, clean damp brush, erases chalk beautifully. Okay, so I have the top of my rails. Now I just need to put in my slats of the rail. Now, you want them to be bigger the closer they are to the bottom of the canvas or the bottom of our bridge, and closer together the farther away they are. So they're spread wide when they are closer to the bottom, and they are tighter and spaced closer together when they're further away. So I'm just gonna start putting in one railing. Oh boy, and be careful if your paint is still wet, you will make a mess. It's okay though, because that's going to actually be that color anyway. And I'm going to space it out about equal distance. Remember, you can use your brush to measure, make it really precise if that's the kind of person you are. And then my next rail is gonna be closer, and my next rail even closer, and it just keeps going that way until I get to the very, very back, where they almost just all become one. Okay, so hopefully that was nice and easy for you. I'm gonna take my medium wash brush, and the only thing I have left to do is to cover up all of my chalk with color number 4. So we're just going to use the top edge of our brush. Remember, how hard you press matters. The harder you press, the thicker your line will be. Now, if you already know that you put a lot of pressure on your brush, just embrace it. This bridge has thick rails, nothing wrong with that, okay? Try to make them a little thinner when they go back, but if you can't, it's not the end of the world. It'll still be a beautiful painting. I'm gonna outline everything, speed up the video, and then we'll move on in a moment. Okay, we're ready to move on. Very last thing that we're gonna do to our bridge, and this is a very fast step. We are going to, this is a fast step before we move on to the real step. We're gonna use color number 5 with a small brush, wash brush or a shader brush. Sorry, wash brush or a round brush, whichever you prefer. I don't like round brushes, so I don't use them very often. And I am going to put a little bit of color number 5 on my bridge, mainly in the middle. Now, color number 5 is a little different than the other colors we've been using because it has more blue in it. And so it just makes your bridge stand out a little bit more against the background. And so I'm just gonna put a little bit of those details on, more at the bottom, kind of fading into the top. You can also just do a little bit right at the top so it kind of transitions from this purple to the blue background. You're also gonna use this to kind of outline the rails, or not outline, apologies, put it in the center of the rails so that the rails kind of pop out a little bit more, especially against all of the purple in the background. This helps just make that feel like it's a little bit closer to us than those trees in the back. So I'm gonna just go over it really, really fast, and then we'll move on to our real step. Make sure you clean out your brush really well before you move on to the real step, which is leaves, because we're transitioning from blue to orange. And those two complement each other very nicely, but they are across from each other in the color wheel and will make brown. Okay, so we start off with some cadmium red, and then we go right into the orange. So that is color number 6 and color number 7. And we're going to put leaves on the edges of our bridge. So if you don't like the edge of your bridge, you're in luck, we're gonna put some leaves on it. So I'm gonna start with color number 6, and you want to be pretty random. You can have some of the leaves kind of coming into the bridge, but mostly they pile up on the edges, and they can heap over and go above the line and cover up the railing. So if you were wondering why we weren't paying a lot of attention to that, that's the reason. And I go all the way back to the very back of my bridge, but remember, it's gonna be bigger if it's closest to us and further away, smaller if it's further away. So big piles transition to tinier piles up here. Okay, once you have some red down, we're gonna put orange right on top. So I just need to have a good red base. And you'll probably notice that it does feel a little dark, that red. That's because that's our base for our orange, which is the real hero of this story. So I'm putting down my orange on top of my red sporadically to highlight and make it stand out a bit more. Give it more dimension and depth. Now it's good to have some dark red showing because that creates dimension and depth as well. It contrasts against the brightness of the orange. Okay, now we're gonna do the exact same thing up in the trees. And this is where the round brush comes in handy because you do want a little bit of a smaller brush, as much as I hate it. And we're gonna start with red once again, up here in the canopy. And right at the ends of the branches, you can start dotting. Now, it doesn't have to stay on the ends of the branches. I like being kind of expressive with my leaves and spacing them out. And just put them wherever you feel like they would be. I'm gonna especially make a lot of leaves above my bridge. Makes sense, since that's where they all ended up. And then once you have some red, you do the exact same thing as we did before with our orange. I'm gonna speed up the video, continue adding some leaves, and then we'll move on in just a moment. Okay, we're ready for our very last step and for color number 8, which is our cadmium yellow. Cadmium medium yellow, actually. And I'm going to use this color not as heavily as we have with the reds and the oranges. Instead, I'm gonna treat this color kind of like the accent color, the highlight, if you will. So it's important to have this used. You're gonna have to use a lot of it because yellow is very weak. So in order to get it to stand out, it has to be kind of chunky. And I'm gonna use this to really highlight the foreground elements. And as I go back, I make it smaller and smaller, okay? And maybe use less and less of it. And once I've done that, I'm gonna do the same thing in the canopy, except in the canopy, I wanna think about the leaves that are in front and the leaves that are behind. If you put leaves on the background trees, don't put any yellow on them. Leave those guys alone. Instead, focus on the canopy maybe over the bridge, maybe the areas that you like the most. The areas that you don't like as much, don't put the yellow on it. And then no one will like go directly to that area. The yellow draws the eye. Okay, so once you have, and you can see I'm not putting a lot of yellow on. Once you have a little bit of yellow, you're good to go. That is just the accent, just use a little bit. And then you are finished with your painting. We're all finished. I hope you enjoyed yourself. This is one of my favorite paintings, and I hope you find a perfect place to put it in your house. See you later.